Hello, welcome to McGill University. Welcome to this gathering organized by the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. Je suis la directrice, Elspeth Hiram. Je suis professeure d'histoire ici. Je vais commencer avec la reconnaissance du territoire traditionnel. L'Université McGill est sur un emplacement qui a longtemps servi de lieu de rencontre et d'échange entre les peuples autochtones, y compris les nations Haudenosaunee et Anishinaabe. McGill honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. We're meeting today, very pleased to say that we're meeting to celebrate Desmond Morton, a founding director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, a great historian and a great Canadian. He was trained at the Royal Military College, at the Collège Militaire Royal Saint-Jean. Then he went to the Royal Military College of Canada, Oxford University, and the London School of Economics. He spent 10 years in the Canadian Army, and then went on to become Professor of History, Principal of Arundel, came to McGill as the founding director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada in 1994 and 94, and remained here until 2001, became the Hiram Mills Professor Emeritus in the Department of History. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He was made an officer of the Order of Canada in 1996, and he is an honorary colonel of 8th Wing Trenton of the Royal Canadian Air Force, and he holds a Canadian Forces decoration. We're very pleased to celebrate Des. We do so in the shadow of the recent passing of Greta Chambers, a great sadness to those of us who looked forward to seeing her here tonight. She was, of course, Chancellor at the time that the MISC was set up, and she joined the board of directors as soon as she stepped down as Chancellor, and she always supported the MISC. I would like to say that, I've worked with both of them, and they brought similar energies to the MISC, a belief not just in the future of Canada as a pluralist, sophisticated nation, but also a fascination with the place that French and English meet. Understanding that shows us sometimes at our best, sometimes at our worst, but always at our most interesting, and helping to explain to everybody else just how interesting that made all of us and how we can use these lessons to get on better. I just say this very quickly. We want to take a more careful and thoughtful recognition of, we're going to introduce you to have speakers to talk to you both a bit about Greta Chambers and Desmond Morton. And first up to do this, I'm very pleased to introduce a previous director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, Professor of Political Science, and currently the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Antonia Maioni.
Thank you, Elspeth. Merci beaucoup. Bonsoir à tous. I'd like to just recognize Des first. I don't know if many of you know this, but Des and I arrived on campus at the same time in the fall of 1994, obviously in different places and in different roles. Back in those days, when assistant professors were, like myself, were expected to be seen but not heard, Desmond actually gave us a voice. And one of the first things he did in arriving at McGill, the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, was to reach out to junior colleagues who were teaching and conducting research on all things Canadian. He encouraged us, he celebrated us. So thank you very much, Des, for doing that. Thank you. Desmond Morton, who we celebrate tonight, as Elspeth Hiram has said, had a lot in common with Greta Chambers. And her loss is felt very heavily, even though this is a night of celebration. Like Desmond, Greta was the very model of a modern public intellectual, literally putting herself out there as a journalist, a writer, a community leader, an advocate for Quebec, for Montreal, and in particular for McGill University. She shared this dedication to the next generation of McGillians and to the mentorship, with the mentorship of all members of this community, students, professors, visitors, young, old, Francophone, Anglophone, Canadian, international. Indeed, I believe that Greta embodied what McGill really is. It's rooted, like her, in Montreal, connected across Canada, and open to the world. Greta was also someone who taught so many of us to be true to our ideals, our authentic selves, while engaging and actively seeking civil debate and measured discussion. Having known Greta for only 20-odd years, I still feel blessed on a personal level for having shared and been able to appreciate her exemplary advice, her exceptional example, and as many of you in this room, I'm sure, also share the memory of her exquisiteness, her exquisite laugh, her wonderful person. I really do think that through her work on behalf of McGill, on behalf of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, that she really did make a difference for Canada itself. And I do believe that through her wisdom, her insights, her deep ability to connect us all, Greta Chambers, a great Montrealer, a great Quebecer, is an important reason that we are celebrating 150 years of Canadian Confederation today. Merci beaucoup, Greta. Another person who can be singled out for this particular honor of shaping today's Canada is, of course, Charles R. Bronfman, the guiding light behind the creation of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada, the leader of the Historica Foundation, and the former president of the Seagram Company. We know him best as one of McGill's most generous donors, a philanthropist who has made the teaching, research, and outreach on Canada one of the Faculty of Arts' highest priorities, and I'm happy to report, greatest successes. He's the author of at least 2 books, or at least the 2 that I've read, The Art of Giving and Distilled, both wonderful testimonies to his abilities to reach out to wide audiences. Most important, he is the man who got Desmond Morton to move to Montreal, to come to McGill, and to be the founding director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada. Talk about knowing how to close the deal. Wasn't going to say the art of the deal, so I won't. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to say that the Honorable Charles R. Bronfman is the reason that we're gathered here tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bronfman.
Always be afraid of those who laud you too much. Chers amis, je suis très content d'être ici ce soir à cet édifice pour saluer notre ami, Monsieur Desmond Morton. I remember when this institute started, and we had 1/3 of the board elected by my family, 1/3 by McGill, and 1/3 joint appointments. And the board had said, well, could we please have 3 candidates to choose from? And one evening, my dear late wife had said, well, we'll have dinner for the board at our house because nobody knows each other. So fine, we had dinner at our house. And I think it was Alec Patterson brought in a folio of one person. And we were all very dinged off, very dinged off. The next day, I believe Alex was who chaired the meeting, and there was a rebellion. The poor candidate could have walked on water. There was no way that that person was going to be appointed. At which point the board gelled. Nobody never knew who was from which group, but all of a sudden we were a real board. So then David Johnson and the then dean sent over another CV of another human being. And I remember Alex and I looked at it because we were going to interview this person. And the CV was just terrible, just terrible. And it was only one person again. And I remember the CV was so bad that I called David Johnson before the meeting, and I said, well, this guy's obviously not going to make it, and what the hell do we do next? He said, well, first of all, have your interview. And the man's background was that he was a socialist, and all he knew about was the army. And we said, well, you know, this is ridiculous. This guy, he fails, no question. He had an F. I used to get those, I know what they are. And then in walked Mr. Desmond Morton and blew Patterson and me away just bingo. And we then had a meeting of the board, and Mr. Morton presented himself again, and the board was blown away bingo. And I have to tell you that sometimes you just get flat out lucky. We didn't know Des from a hole in the wall. There could have been no better person in this country who could have been the initial director of the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada than my good friend and man to whom all of us who love MISC are indebted and grateful. Des, had there ever been anybody who could have done a better job? I've never met him. So thank you, thank you, thank you for the, how many years, 10 years? You spent at MISC. They were 10 wonderful years, and you led the way to the appointment of another wonderful person who's sitting on your right, Antonia Maioni, who is now our beloved dean. So thank you, thank you, thank you for everything you've done. I now pass the mantle to Professor Abella, I believe. Is that what I'm supposed to do? Are you going to take over this thing? By the way, I have to apologize because I can't hear Des's lecture this afternoon. I wish to heck I could, but unfortunately this is a bad day, and I have to do 3 other things right away. Professor Abella, my dear friend.
Thank you, Charles. It was with much pleasure that I accepted the invitation to say a few words about Des Morton's contribution to the field of Canadian labor history. But the truth is that Professor Morton is such a prolific scholar that there are a whole series of areas of Canadian history to which he has made seminal contributions. I could just as easily have talked about Des Morton and French Canada, Des Morton and military history, Des Morton and Canadian government and political parties, or Des Morton and the Canadian left, or Des Morton on the First World War. The list is endless, but it signifies just how important he has been to the study of Canada. I don't think, in fact, I can't think of anyone who has made such a series of fundamental contributions in so many different areas of Canadian history. I first met Des long before he was an academic. As a high school student in the spring of, I think it was 1962, I volunteered to work in the federal election campaign in my home riding of York South for the NDP candidate David Lewis. So one day I'm at my usual table in the office, stuffing envelopes, which was all I was fit to do at the time, when suddenly the door opens up, and you've got to imagine David Lewis's campaign office. It's full of Jewish intellectuals, trade unionists, radicals, all sorts of noisy people. When suddenly the door opens and in walks a Canadian soldier in full military uniform. A deathly silence fell over the office. I could literally see people scurrying for the back door, wondering what was happening. When this soldier walks resolutely to the front of the room, approaches the campaign manager, Stephen Lewis, and announces and states, in fact, 5 words that have resonated in NDP history ever since: Captain Morton reporting for duty. And of course, we know he delivered. David Lewis won that election, was later elected leader of the NDP, and Stephen Lewis used these words as a slogan, as campaign rhetoric for the next 40 years, including in many after-dinner speeches, which is where I remember hearing them last time. Oh yes, labor history. To students of the trade union movement, Professor Morton's writings have been crucial and seminal. I began teaching Canadian labor history at York University in the early 1970s. It was a period in when the literature in that field consisted of several amateurish histories and my own book, which wasn't my own first book, which wasn't much better. It was not until the appearance of Professor Morton's book on Canadian working women in 1978, followed a short time later by his volume with Terry Kopp on the Canadian working class, that we finally had some textbooks for labor history which academics could use. These were influential, as were his later books, The History of Canada's Labor Movement, People's History, Working People, and the Labor Movement in Canada. These, along with a couple of dozen articles he wrote, especially his monumental overview of the field in 2000, Some Millennial Reflections on the State of Canadian Labor History, these have cemented Des's reputation among the leading experts, foremost experts in working class history in this country. It is worth noting that Professor Morton refuses to describe himself as a historian of the working class. Rather, he prefers to describe himself as an industrial relations historian. Either way, he has made an exceptional contribution to the field, whatever you call it. What is not in dispute is that Des was a pioneer in the study of Canadian workers' history. His early study of working women in Canada appeared long before research on the role of Canadian women had become de rigueur in Canadian studies. His book, Bread and Roses, surveys the period from the mid-1800s through the 1960s and 70s, uncovering the story and especially the hardships faced by working women, ranging from domestic servants and factory workers to the first women doctors and lawyers of a later period. The work was amongst the very first to write women back into their real place in Canadian history and to bring to life the largely ignored women who helped build this country into what it is today. These books, his early books, were eye-openers and deeply appreciated by students of Canadian labor and indeed all Canadians. His next books on the Canadian worker were exquisitely detailed and elegantly written, as are all of his publications. Des writes as no one else, crisp, accurate, and graceful. These volumes were among the first academics' works to explore the history of the Canadian labor movement, going back to the early period, the early 1800s, and concluding with an analysis of globalization and its impact on Canadian workers. What is special and unique about these studies is that they examine the clash between the idealists who fought for such impossible dreams as the 8-hour day, paid holidays, minimum wages, equality for women, and industrial democracy, and the realists who wrestled with the human frailties of self-interest, prejudice, and fear. These are battles that still go on today. Above all, these books document the struggles of Canadian workers over the past 200 years for dignity and security, and no one has done it better than Des Morton. Let me conclude with what I think has been Des's most consequential and enduring contribution: his popularization of Canadian history in general and to a general audience. He writes for a popular audience like no one else who is a professional historian. Several years ago, when he received the Pierre Berton Award for Excellence in Bringing History to a Wider General Public, Professor Morton was described as someone who cares deeply about how history is taught in our schools and how it is remembered in our communities. His career reflects his strong commitment to helping bridge between academic research and popular understanding of our past. Much as I tried, I couldn't have said it better. Des Morton is a superstar in the pantheon of Canadian historians. Through his countless books, articles, pamphlets, speeches, and television shows, he has brought Canadian history to life and raised interest in and knowledge of Canadian history from coast to coast to coast. How lucky we have been at MISC and McGill to have had him for so many years. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Morton and to ask him to the podium. Des Morton, thanks.
Thank you very much, Irving, and thank you very much for those who joined in the applause, because I was quite unaware of all of this, except some hints and notices and warnings from various times. And I'm going to now challenge anything kindly he and others have said about me as a teacher by talking about what I hope will be the basis of another book before the printing industry goes under. And that is, does Canadian military history include Quebec? And I will argue that it has to. When Pauline Marois became Quebec's Minister of Education, she quickly banned military history from the curriculum. It was, she told us, too vile, too humiliating for children to suffer. Well, that's her business, and I accept that. A change of government has not, in fact, reversed her judgment, nor resolved Quebecers' own indifference to the topic. When I settled at McGill in 1994, I discovered at that time that Remembrance Day was conscientiously ignored. Still, no one objected when I took a few bucks from my pocket, recruited a Black Watch piper to play an appropriate lament in the halls of the Arts Building at McGill. It was a practice I had brought with me from that deep, dark, evil place, Ontario. As principal at Airedale College, which she's kindly mentioned, I used to get a piper from the Lorne Scots, a Brampton-based regiment, and bring him over, or her, they were both, and to play laments and to play the military appropriate music for the day, because I thought our students needed to know that that was part of their tradition. Well, things even at McGill change. Tons of military hardware now crowd into McGill College Street. Regular members of the Canadian Forces, militia, bands, cadets from my alma mater, the Collège Militaire Royal de Saint-Jean, crowd into the lower campus to celebrate the 11th of November. McGill's own war memorial, which does exist, sadly, so far, plays little or no role on November the 11th. If snow has fallen, its front door is effectively frozen shut by heaving pavements, unless someone has learned how to navigate the university's athletic accommodation and can find their way upstairs and downstairs and all around the clock to get to this memorial hall. It is as empty on Remembrance Day as on any other. I think that should change, obviously. So I've offended some of the administrators here present who've told me there's nothing they can do about it until somebody gives them the money. Well, we did recruit almost a whole battalion of infantry for the First World War here at McGill. We were the first university to launch a Canadian Officers Training Corps in 1912, followed closely by Université de Montréal. Indeed, it has almost seemed impolite to make remembrance of war a theme in this talk and a reminder of too many of my published books. I have, of course, been a professor of history for some 55 years. Memories lie, sometimes blatantly, but if they are the core of my profession, And when the deadliest weapons of mass destruction are wielded against our nearest neighbor by a dictator whose people currently starve, and I speak of North Korea, to finance his insane belligerence. To the relief of Madame Marois, I'm not standing here to persuade my colleagues and the rest of you that Quebec has played a significant role in Canada's military history. I believe it has, but in all sorts of ways. Long before the British battlefield victory in 1759, French soldiers had shaped Franco-Indigenous relations in New France. Summoned to protect the Catholic Church from the progress of Protestantism, the Council of Trent had ruled, henceforth only bishops could be trusted to ordain the faithful and morally virtuous clergy. But when Bishop Pontbriand died in Montreal in 1760, there he is, the Catholic Church actually had 200 vacancies for unordinated priests. Could the Church have survived in Quebec in this situation? I think with great difficulty, and as General Murray, the governor of Quebec City, worried, turbulence. His argument for helping the Catholic Church get a bishop was simply that it would save money sending out reinforcements to the Quebec garrison. And that happened. The bishop was chosen. He was the Vicar General of Quebec, a bishop named Briand, who was actually related to Bishop Pontbriand, but not very closely. Both were Breton. Unlike other vicars general, Briand had accepted the Vatican doctrine that faithful Catholics owed full allegiance to whatever secular leader God had given them, namely, in the case of them in Quebec, George III, Fidei Defensor, it says on your coins, still to this day, a defender of the faith, not the faith, but of a faith. And His Most Christian Majesty Louis XV, the alternative leader, was ruled out. He had failed. Murray's military career ends, I think, with a role nobody in Quebec has ever even thought of as the savior of the Catholic Church, and a man who put his career at risk. He was promptly dismissed, and he was only rehired when they needed a general to sacrifice in defending the island of Minorca in the Mediterranean. And as a man in his 80s, and I feel every pinch of it, he was sent to fight an impossible task. And he succeeded for over a year. So maybe God was helping him too. Briand repaid Murray by his stubborn insistence on Quebecois loyalty to Britain and the Crown. That loyalty allowed Canadians to reinforce the British Army in the War of 1812, de Salaberry's victories at Châteauguay and under another commandant, a francophone, a battalion at Chrysler's Farm made the difference by slaughtering the Americans with their accurate fire. Not many people in Quebec think about the War of 1812 as their victory. Least of all the people who live next door in Ontario, where I've been preaching this doctrine. I thought everybody hated it, until I hear Irving Abella tell me I'm popular side. Well, I couldn't find any friends at the time. Canadian historians still debate why Sir Robert Borden broke his repeated promise that service in this new Great War would be nothing but voluntary. The hard answer may be that in the spring and summer of 1916, the war had rescued the Canadian economy. People looking for jobs could easily find them, and find them at rates of pay that were quite unprecedented. Joining the Army for $1.10 a day was no longer necessary for families. Major General Willoughby Gwatkin, a British officer who commanded the Canadian militia during the war, had warned that voluntary enrollment would limit a Canadian expeditionary force to about 2 divisions. about 40 to 50,000 men. Well, it didn't turn out to be, but Watkin was about right. Instead of 2 divisions, we had 4, but not much more. France, the contingent left 4 divisions in a Canadian Corps in France, fighting on the Western Front, and a 5th division in England to give a command to the son of the Minister of Militia and Defense, Garnet Hughes, a young man of great ambition. His father, I think it's fair to say, was a bigoted Orangeman. He had ignored a British suggestion that he form a Royal Montcalm regiment as a gesture to please our infrequent ally of France. But Hughes ignored the request, and the only Francophone part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in 1914 was 1 company of the 14th Battalion, about 120 men. Since almost no one else in the unit spoke French, the arrangement with the 14th Battalion failed utterly. An October meeting organized by Dr. Arthur Mignot, one of Quebec's wealthiest pharmaceutical producers, persuaded Morton to insist on a strictly Francophone 22e Bataillon as part of the 5th Brigade of Canada's 2nd Contingent. That was the only French-Canadian unit allowed to get to the front line, and it was outstanding. As Colonel, Sam Hughes had proposed, of course he chose colonels and generals and anybody else, but that Lieutenant Colonel Frédéric Gaudet, an RMC graduate of many, many years before, he was a man in his 60s, was a complete failure. Gaudet had been told to reform the Ross rifle. You've heard of the Ross rifle. If you haven't, you should know it's really a triumph of Canadian incompetence. It was an Austrian rifle left over from the 1860s that had a straight pull. So if the bullet was jammed in the breech, you couldn't get it out. People tried. They used their boots. All that came off was the back of the shell. There they are in the front line with the Germans on the other side, letting them win the war. Well, Gaudet admitted that he had failed, but the gun was no good at all. Can you tell the government that? Canada's military acquisitions program, it reveals that nothing much has changed for the better. Well, Gaudet had one success. Instead of training in Montreal, as it expected, the volunteers for the 22nd Battalion were all shifted to Saint-Jean-sur-Richelieu, far enough away, a place that had only barracks for horses, so that the men lived in some discomfort, nothing like the discomfort they would face in battle, but some preparation, and at least 20 miles away from the flesh pots and taverns of Montreal. I say all this because the other French-Canadian battalion that started out was the 41st, and I had very great difficulty finding a worse battalion than the 41st. It stayed in Montreal. It recruited its members from shelters for the unemployed and the unemployable and put them in the army. The 41st Battalion was undoubtedly the worst battalion that was recruited from Canada for the First World War. And it was a tragedy because it became the example everybody quoted when they wanted to describe the French-Canadian contribution to the war. Gaudet also had chosen, wisely, a much younger fellow RMC graduate named Thomas Tremblay to be second in command and training officer for his battalion. Tremblay was a major figure in Canada. He was the colonel of the 22nd. More important in the long run, Tremblay had been taught by young British officers who had had the experience of the Boer War and who had spent the time since the Boer War trying to figure out what exactly was wrong with the British Army, and they found lots. Officers, they concluded, are only entitled to their men's obedience if they have earned it by their own performance. Imagine that as a principle in your lives. Seditious nonsense, the veterans in the room will tell me. See what happened, I'll tell you. An even more important reason for Morton's caution was that Britain had finally summoned him and other premiers from the dominions across the world to London in the spring of 1917. They soon learned that the Great War was going very badly. Russia, the biggest ally, the great hope, was on the verge of collapse by 1917. France was hardly in better shape after its desperate defense of Verdun. The Americans were the real hope. They might join the Allies, but why and when? President Woodrow Wilson had won the 1916 re-election partly with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." Why would he change? Canada, in contrast, had won Vimy Ridge after both a cheering French and a failing French and a failing British assault in 1915. When Canadians actually succeeded in April 1917 of gaining and holding Vimy Ridge, Morton's fellow prime ministers were on hand to congratulate him. Was this a moment when he was to say, I can't possibly maintain the Canadian Corps at this present strength? Canada had a population of about 8 million. Australia had a population of about 5 million. New Zealand, 1 million. They were able to keep 2 army corps at the front. Canada couldn't keep even 1. Well, ironically, in the light of French-Canadian criticism of their country's role in the war, the Vandus remained, as I've said before, the only French-speaking unit in the Canadian Corps. Incidentally, the battalion followed the linguistic rules that our first Minister of Militia, Sir Georges-Étienne Cartier, had established in 1868. Commands in the Canadian militia would be given in English. Reports would be given in English. There was no place for French in the Canadian militia, and there would be no place for them in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. The Vandus, as fellow soldiers referred to them, received orders, provided its reports in English, like any other militia regiment did in those days. Well, over 90% of its members were Canadiens Français. It had enlisted 100 Franco-Americans and close to 100 others whose first language was anything but English. So how do you talk to them in all their languages? Tough conditions that Godet had ordered gave recruits second thoughts about volunteering. A further test was spending most of the first year in the appalling conditions of the trench line in front of Ypres, where all Canadians were sort of put through it like an ordeal. That allowed the unit to escape the series of disasters associated with the British offensive on the Somme River in France, several days' march to the south. Last year, as you may remember, our government did what it could to make Canadians more aware of the near annihilation of Raw Battalion of Newfoundlanders at Beaumont-Hamel, the opening phase of the Somme campaign. So we've heard about it. Canadians played a role. It would be the turn of the 22nd Battalion in the very last offensive of the Somme campaign to attack a place called Courcelette, with a farming village with a sugar factory in the middle. By now, command had shifted from Godet to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Tremblay, a much younger man, a prime athlete at RMC, and a man who had not forgotten what those British instructors had taught him. While they trained in England, some British officers were in charge. They announced that tomorrow we are going on a 24-mile route march. Colonel Tremblay said, but they just had their vaccination, and in those days a vaccination was a very heavy medical burden. Well, they showed up for parade because the British officers snorted and laughed and said, well, they'll do as they're told, won't they? And they did. They marched. They fell out by the wayside. But Colonel Tremblay had ordered 2 ambulances and a truck to pass along in the rear. Got those out of the medical authorities, and they were used. The astonishing thing to the troops was that Colonel Tremblay showed up with his horse, properly saddled, and walked the way. He suffered severely from it, but he had shown that he could do it. During their training in England, as I said, they were compelled to see an officer set the example of courage and self-sacrifice. Months later, Tremblay was in fact the commanding officer of the 22nd, and he received the orders to attack the village of Courcelette, which I've mentioned, supported on its flanks by 2 other battalions of the 5th Canadian Brigade. On the chosen day, the senior officers of the attack gathered, and as usual with Canadian meetings, went overtime. Colonel Tremblay got out of the meeting and discovered that it was just about 0 hour. Do we ask them for a delay? He said, no, watch me. And Tremblay simply walked across the trenches held by his regiment until he got to the front line. There he lifted his leg over the parapet and began to walk down the hill towards the sugar factory. His men looked at him. We don't know how many decided, I'll go, but some did, most did. Some said, no, I'm not doing that, and they stayed. But that was his test. Will they follow my kind of obedience and my kind of discipline? Because I'm not going to tell them to go get killed. Tremblay survived the battle. 5 other officers of the regiment survived the battle. 130 odd men survived the battle from the entire 900 Bandus that were in action. It was a terrible loss, but the exception was that they held on to what they had captured. For the first time in the campaign of the Somme, they had not been driven back. The Germans had had a terrible problem. You see, they're looking up the hill. They see this obvious lunatic of an officer climb over the trench and start walking down towards them. Is this the time to call in the artillery and blast the earth away? Maybe not. So they wait until about half the battalion has appeared on the battlefield, and then they open fire. But half the battalion does not get as many casualties as the other 2 battalions on either side, and they can hold their ground against not 1, but 8 German counterattacks that evening and the next day. It was an amazing victory, and a victory that I think transformed our war effort, because from then on, Canadians could be used as attacking troops. The Courcelette battle was the last victory that saved Douglas Haig's career. Lloyd George had become Prime Minister, a Welsh Liberal. He had no respect for Douglas Haig, no sharing of Haig's belief that God had chosen him to command the British Army. None of that. Well, Courcelette is the change. It ended the dismal series of failures that had marked the summer for the British commander, Sir Douglas Haig. Tremblay had also created that dilemma for the German army by his system of command. Tremblay was halfway to the sugar factory before the German guns opened fire. The losses were painful. As I said, 700 men down the hill, most of them dead, but able to defend what they'd taken. The losses were painful, but enough Bandus survived to deal with the 8 distinct counterattacks by the Germans. Tremblay's battalion had quite unintentionally persuaded the British commander-in-chief that Canadians would be the Sturmtruppen he'd wanted and needed, but had never had the courage to create. The result was that we lost more men in the second last year of the war than any battle before, and even more in 1918. We were the people who fought and captured Passchendaele, the terrible mud bath of a battle. We were the ones who proceeded after the Battle of Amiens August the 8th, 1918, to win the war. Currie knew it. Currie was the man who a conservative member of parliament demanded be fired, brought home, and charged with manslaughter for all the casualties the Canadians were suffering. But Currie realized by talking to German prisoners that they felt totally deceived by their commanders who promised them victory in 1918. The Russians had collapsed. The whole German army from the Eastern Front had been made available to the Western Front, and it didn't make any difference. They were defeated. Systematically, the Canadians were the chief attackers. Not because they were particularly good at it or lucky, but because they were prepared to do it to win the war. If we didn't win the war, I leave you to hypothesize about that, not my trade. Tremblay's battalion had quite unintentionally persuaded General Haig that the Canadians were attackers. His immediate reward was command of the 5th Brigade. The 22e had given the Canadian Corps a role that it would play at enormous cost to Canadian lives for the rest of the war, from Vimy Ridge to Mons in Belgium on November the 11th, 1918. We on that day entered Mons, and we on that day watched the Germans send envoys to the French front to ask for a ceasefire. That's how armies quit, and they had to quit. And the Canadians were there to see it happen. And the 22e were there to see them happen too. The ban on teaching Quebec's military history created my habit of asking Francophone audiences, not about Courcelette, but about a battle called Chérisy. It was, and still is, Chérisy, what the French call a bourg. A bourg is a farm village just big enough to provide the local farmers with a market for their production. Chérisy may be the Quebec counterpart of Beaumont-Hamel. How many people in this very disparate audience have ever heard of the Battle of Chérisy? Good for you. My wife has. Ad nauseum. Ad nauseum. But the battalion had captured it. It went into battle with 700 men. It emerged with 39. And all the officers were wounded or killed, including Georges Vanier, who lost his right leg. So it was a very important battle. We never hear about it. If you look at the official history, you'll see nothing about Chérisy, except they put it on a map. Nice of them. Well, that's why I want to teach a course and have taught courses here for 2 years on can Quebec be included in Canadian military history? Because it can, at an enormously high rate of performance. Chérisy may be the Quebec counterpart of Beaumont-Hamel. Even the frontispiece painting, which I hope is appearing soon, there it is, and it's called the attack on de Ville-Saint-Vaast. It's not. It's the Battle of Chérisy by a Belgian war artist, a battle that I think Quebecers should remember. It will not do you great pleasure or pride. When the unit's medical officer, Captain Alberic Marin, learned that the regiment had taken Chérisy, except for a German machine gun at one end of the village, he tore off his Red Cross and threw it on the ground and went out and said to the 39 survivors, "Will you help me finish the job?" And they did. He lost his leg. He gained a military cross for courage. The symbol of his non-combatant status was that Geneva Cross he turned off. Perhaps the chief marvel of Chérisy is that the 22nd Battalion was back in action within a month. The Canadiens were winning the war, but at a terrible cost in lives. Arthur Currie, the commander of the Canadian Corps after Sir Julian Byng was promoted to command one of the British armies in France. I mentioned the member of parliament who wanted Currie fired and charged with manslaughter. I could go on. Currie's greatest victory was probably the Battle of Amiens on August the 8th, 1918. At a cost of 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded, the Canadians had cost the Germans about 27,000 men, but half of them were prisoners. That's when they realized that the morale of the German army had begun to collapse. And therefore, the best way to win the war was to keep on pushing. And some of you may have ancestors who were victims of that reality. But should we have let the war continue for more years? When the German general, Erich von Ludendorff, referred to the Canadian victory at Amiens on August 8th, 1918, he called it a black day of the German army, recalling a battle in which, for the first time, trained German soldiers felt so betrayed by their commanders that veteran units surrendered without even token resistance. Half the German losses simply became Canadian or British prisoners of war. On November the 11th, 1918, after a series of similar victories at Cambrai, Valenciennes, and crossing the Canal du Nord, Canadians had fought their way into the Belgian city of Mons, where our war had begun for the British Army back in August of 1914. The day we went into Mons became our day of remembrance for the most terrible war we Canadians have so far had to fight. A lone unit of French-Canadian soldiers shaped our steady series of victories in our first great war. We, I believe, owe them recognition for what our fellow citizens accomplished through their example. November the 11th was also, as I said, the day when the Germans gave up. That's when they sent their envoys across the war to ask for a ceasefire. Currie's relentless attacks had pursued a victory. However close to victory they had become, Currie left them no choice. German generals had to take responsibility for losing our history's most devastating, divisive, and destructive war. If I've offended anyone, and I hope I haven't, but I've probably done the job historians are supposed to do. If, as Madame Marois complained, we've produced adult entertainment, we do so in the hope, I think, for the most part, of deterring our civilization in the year 2017 from launching a war certain to destroy civilization as we have known it. And I've mentioned that setting without dwelling on it. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Des. Will you take a few questions?
We, sir.
We have mics here, so
Sorry.
if you raise your hand, the mic will come to you.
Professor Morton, it is evidence rather than conjecture that's your forte, much as I appreciate that. I'm going to ask you perhaps to break the rule anyway and to offer some conjecture. My question is the neglect of French history, French military history in Canada, just coincidental, or do you think there is a particular reason that it happened and it was planned, or is it just one of these chance things?
Well, I think it is happening because it is obvious that English Canadians are taught English Canadian history. Quebec students are taught Quebec history. And Quebec people who designed that program are not necessarily prepared to talk about these very unpleasant issues. I have not tried to hide the huge casualty lists that the Vandus absorbed, nor would I want them reabsorbed today or tomorrow. I worry a great deal about the leadership of our world at the present time, when its peace is challenged by a country a small country, which has its grievances, serious grievances, but which threatens us all with missiles warheaded with nuclear weapons. That is my warning. I'm not by profession an optimist. I am very often accused of quite the opposite. But I am concerned that we don't always learn from history because people want history changed, altered in their favor. And I exist to try to get those errors criticized and repaired. It's not easy. Sir.
Thank you.
Dr. Morton, is there any reason why you've not mentioned the Battle of Hill 70, where my grandfather died with the Vandus? That was a significant battle.
It was, and I have not mentioned other battles that were also significant, including the whole experience on the Ypres front. But you're right, I was told also not to go on forever and ever. And Vimy is one of those. Vimy was an interesting Canadian battle because the hill was a German position taken in the confidence assurance that the Germans would send soldier after soldier after soldier to recapture it. And they did. And the Canadians, by expecting that, had organized their artillery and found the means to make sure that their efforts to retake Hill 70 were failures, costly failures. But people often who died at Hill 70 have every right to know that they did. And if I didn't mention it, I apologize. Sir. Mike.
Oh, sorry, I thought there was somebody else.
She's coming.
I understand that this was about World War I, but I'm curious what your opinion is, and I actually don't know it, but the French-Canadian contribution during the American Revolution. I believe because the Americans did come up and invaded Quebec during the Revolution, did they not?
Yeah, they did, and they went back again. Thank God. And in 1812, they came up, and that at the Battle of Chrysler's Farm, they were stopped from getting any closer to Montreal because a French-Canadian, half of the Voltigeurs Canadiens had been sent to help protect Upper Canada. Half remained behind and fought at the Battle of Chateauguay. And both battles were victories for our side, if you like, a side that includes French Canadians. They were very good soldiers. They had officers who had been trained in the British Army, which may not have been the best kind of training in the world, but it was pretty good. And it worked. We were saved. Does any Ontario textbook ever tell you that the victory at Chrysler's Farm, which is Upper Canada Village, was won by French Canadians? I somehow don't think so. Not the textbooks I had to read and use. So I enjoyed, as a teacher, telling Ontarians they'd been lied to by their own government. Nothing to do with the NDP or anything like that. Anyway,
I'd like
sir.
to ask you about Margaret Macmillan, right in 1919, and
Yeah.
the Treaty of Versailles. I know it's a little later, but how could it be so poorly worded and accepted, and it led to, as you know, the Second World War? That's what my impression. I'm an engineer, so I didn't read the whole book.
Okay. Did you know that an engineer, a French-Canadian engineer, was the chief engineer of the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps? Both of them?
Not surprised.
They were sons of the Quebec premier, who was a liberal at the time. So liberal he believed in ending taxation. I think there's some liberals still like that. Anyway, thank you, Barry.
Would you comment how bad it is?
Well, yeah, it could be worse.
Oh, okay.
And when you write your book, I mean, Sam wrote his. And, so go ahead, please. Time, you did. Anybody else? Thank you very much.
I wonder if I could ask a question about the history. Do you think the better history of battles, of the wars, is going to come out of university historians or military historians? Which do you like to read better?
Well, so far it hasn't come from government historians, because the book that for this, the book for which this is the frontispiece is the official history of the Canadian Army in the First World War by Jerry Nicholson. And I knew Jerry because I did work some of those years as a soldier, not flaunting my uniform for the NDP, thank you very much, but try to write books that my colleagues would accept. And I knew he, from a perspective as a pre-war Saskatoon high school principal, was not going to take too much fond comment about French Canadians. And, but the section was that sort of thing. It was a very Anglo organization. John Swettenham and I used to make fun of this, but nobody from Collège Militaire ever got very far as a military historian in this country. Fortunately, my friend Gagnon, who wrote a book, The History of the 22nd Battalion, I'm embarrassed to say it, but mentions my name about 13 times, or more like 30, I think. Anyway, so we're getting there. And he's a professional academic. So there's hope for us. Not much, but some.
We just wanted to say a very special thank you as well to Professor Morton for all the history that he's taught us over the years. I do find it really quite extraordinary, fabulous and wonderful that it's very much a history of ordinary people, continually written with enormous skepticism of the higher commands and the bureaucrats. Always, you know, the study of the French Canadians in the 7 Years' War, right? There they are fighting, and the French military command really doesn't understand them. Or soldiers' wives during the First World War, and finding themselves looking for help from the state, support, and the state really doesn't understand them, really doesn't understand the soldiers, doesn't, you know, there's this gap between ordinary people and the command, the authority. And yet you managed to bring these qualities into academia, to be a professor. I think you're in some respects, you know, help us to take a distance from university pieties because of your background, and even become an administrator. Somehow the MISC has really benefited from this creative tension between, you know, the ordinary history and the official history, the official view of authority. Right. Okay. This is the 7th edition of A Short History of Canada. It is now ranking number 5 on the Globe and Mail. It's just come out, re-edited, and it's 5th on the Globe and Mail bestseller list. It's one of more than 40 books that he's published. We wanted to say a particular thank you that recognizes, if you're going to honor somebody who writes like that, the one obvious thing that you can do is to give an essay prize. So we would like to announce that we're creating a Desmond Morton undergraduate essay prize for the best essay each year in the McGill Institute for the Study of Canada in Canadian Studies, and just hoping that we will manage to encourage the next generation of beautiful writers, concise, you know, clear analysis, and forthcoming writers, whether they're historians, which would be nice, or public intellectuals of the stature of Desmond Morton. So.